entrepreneurs who say, we have to fly to the coasts, even though there's billionaires downtown. We have to fly to the coast to get any venture capital or angel capital. That's a fixable problem without looking outside of your own community. Opportunity zones is a great organizing principle for tackling that challenge.
So I want to bring it down to Atlanta. That was a great table setting, and you could see if this actually works. This is not just a short-term kind of tax incentive, which gets everyone in the U.S. excited. This could actually create some new norms around finance for entrepreneurs, for neighborhood regeneration, right? I mean, this could have a big, sort of long tail, so to speak, right? So yesterday we went on a really interesting tour around your central business district. AJ took us around, Cap took us around. Then we went to Vine City, which is really where I want to focus. And then we went to Fort Mac. Who knew, right? That you had a military fort here, but that's a whole different story. I want to focus on Vine City, and I want Ross to start by basically saying you've been engaged there, and you've been engaged in ways that are building off of lessons and experience that you've had in Louisville that has a real theory of change to it. And I thought it would be great if you could express that to the audience and then take the Louisville experience and apply it to Vine City and what it might mean in the next few years.
Yeah, so I want to start by saying, Keitt, you're if I only knew that there was all this stuff going on when I had capital gains, that would be much more interesting. I want to frame it by saying one of the things that I've observed is most investors who want to put money into opportunity zones are likely to behave exactly like you. So you were doing nothing wrong. You were the norm. And realizing capital gains when you sell a stock or sell your business or sell real estate, it's usually unpredictable. And one of the things that I am seeing all across the country is, there's an article about opportunity zones. I am quoted in the article. I get 10 emails following up from a random person in Florida saying, I have 3 months left on the timer to get my capital gains. Do you know where I can put this $250,000 that I just made? We're seeing that all the time. Sure, John's hearing a lot about that, and I think that it's very, very different from if you're in real estate or private equity or venture capital, where you say, when we raised our $20 million fund at Village Capital, we raised $20 million. We had 5 years to invest. And we say, we're out. We're looking for deals. This is wonderful. We can pick the best transactions. The 6-month turnaround, John would say it's one of those things that's a feature, not a bug, because it actually encourages pre-development. So one of my big observations for Atlanta is the supply of capital interested in opportunity zones is and will dramatically exceed the quality of investable projects. And so your story is going to happen over and over and over again. And so coming up with models or prototypes, or in the investment world, as they'd say, products of here's a good place to put capital where we've been thoughtful and we've done some work, and you can put $4 million in equity into X, and the pre-work's been done is what you can be doing right now when you leave here. So we've been thinking about different types of models for that, and I have a personal experience with one. So, we've been active investing in entrepreneurs in cities across the country, and we've been disproportionately active in a few cities. But one of these cities is Louisville, Kentucky. And anyone from Louisville? You're from Louisville, so all right. Well, there we go. Well placed. So. Shelby Park in Louisville, it's in southeast Louisville. It's very similar demographics to the west side of Atlanta, about 50% vacancy, 23,000 median income. And we had made a couple of direct investments in companies in Louisville, and we started to see in cities like Atlanta and Louisville just the momentum that a growing company can provide to its community. And we were invested in this one company that was kind of one-off. It was in Shelby Park, and we started talking with a number of different people in the neighborhood around what businesses like this could do for the community. Now, if you look at me, I obviously am not from Vine City. Born and raised in Atlanta, but didn't grow up in Vine City. Didn't grow up in Shelby Park. I think my opinion of what Shelby Park needs is totally irrelevant. So we started and we did a lot of listening to what people wanted, and we pointed to that building and this building and seeing what was there. And so, for example, we learned one of the large buildings at kind of the main commercial street corner. It was a large building. It was abandoned, and it was used as kind of an off the books brothel, a hub of the sex trafficking industry in Louisville. It was a real raw spot for the community, and they said, if you're going to do something in this community, like, you got to do something about that. And that was very, very important. That was something that we heard. And so we worked with a community development corporation, some foundations, the community foundation, some private investors. What we ended up doing was, instead of saying, hey, we do startups, we're going to invest in a bunch of startups and see if it works, and you do housing and that's what you do, we actually syndicated a whole portfolio. So we had a goal. The community said, we want vacancy filled in. We don't want you, even if it's the most perfectly planned thing ever, we don't want you to displace anybody, and we want you to fill in what's vacant. And these are the people from the community who have businesses that we really like and we want to encourage. And we also want people from outside the community to bring jobs here. And that was just through a number of different sessions and conversations. What we ended up doing was we raised $4 million in equity investment and $1 million in philanthropy to apply to this just 3x3 block radius. So, for example, we acquired the building that had been the brothel. We converted it to commercial real estate, and the ground floor tenant, this woman who was a resident in the community who ran a nonprofit that helped women in the sex trafficking industry find living wage jobs, she had an idea to open up a bakery. And so 3 years later, it's a bakery where women get paid living wage, $12 to $15, and it was a very positive sign of momentum in the community. Like, this is going the right track. And we invested all in all from Main Street businesses like the bakery to higher growth tech companies that were not run by people who are from the community, but bringing in good paying jobs and people who will buy $4 lattes at the bakery. And all of these things make an economy work. 4 years later, so there's basically no vacancy. There's also been no displacement. There's been significant boosts in the median income of this one neighborhood because there are 250 new jobs just in the neighborhood. And the portfolio, if you're an equity investor, the portfolio is doubled in value over a 4-year period, which is looking very good. It's looking on the right track. So it's something that took a lot of planning, a lot of conversations, a lot of collaboration. Real estate people typically are kind of transactional, deal by deal. The real estate partner we worked with, it was a little bit of a different process than we're used to, but it's the kind of thing that you can see all across the country. There are tens of thousands of street corners like this one in Shelby Park. So, I've probably been in 20 different cities just in the last 6 months. And every time I tell the story, people say, oh, you should look at this street corner or that street corner. So, on the west side alone, there are 4 or 5 nodes that we've been looking at and thinking about what's the right syndication of local businesses and growing businesses that might be in other parts of Atlanta but might have a mission that serves the community. What's the right mixture of philanthropy and government and private sector partnership? Not everything is market rate 8 to 11% return, which a private investor would be pretty excited about with this tax advantage. The bakery got a very low interest rate loan from a nonprofit community development financial institution. So instead of saying, hey, there's all this money, lets us sitting on stage, put it to work in neighborhoods we have nothing about, there's actually an amazing opportunity to spur on some conversations where the community can really lead what the thesis is.
So just to follow up, so what you've done in Shelby Park, you think is absolutely applicable to Vine City? Because Vine City seems to have a strategic location that frankly few low-income neighborhoods have in the United States. I mean, it's literally walking distance to the downtown. I mean, where does this apply, and how fast could some of these investments occur?
So in the right context, it does. So, I've been working closely with Suganthi and Frank at the Blank Foundation, as well as some other folks in this room, around some specific ideas in Vine City. And I think, every community has different needs and worries and values. So, for example, there's a business owner who's in Vine City, and she runs a laundromat, and she's running a really successful business. We said, if we do this, she said, I would absolutely love to be an anchor tenant in this property. But she starts asking questions about the tax incentive. She goes, so you're going to own this building out of your fund or whatever, and 10 years from now, you've got a big incentive to sell it to someone else. who's getting paid when that happens? And she says, I'm going to be, if I'm going to sign a 10-year lease, I'm going to be paying rent. Is there some way that I can do a kind of lease to own and build ownership equity in the business? And I said, yeah, I mean, that's actually very exciting. And that's the kind of, I think that's the kind of innovation the average real estate investor, is looking to flip in 3 to 5 years. But if you're holding a property in a 10-year period, if she says, if you sell for a really good price and I own some equity, I've earned some equity percentage in it, that's actually wonderful. Or, maybe I can decide not to sell because I have some ownership and say in what's going on. So I think the most important and most exciting conversations from an impact perspective are certain features of this tool can put things like transitioning renters to owners on the table that wouldn't fit in the typical, pro forma.
So everyone should get ready for questions. I'm sure there are going to be a few. But Keitt, you were on the tour yesterday. What did you take away from seeing whether it's the Central Business District or Vine City or Fort Mac from a banker perspective? Because from an outsider's perspective, it's like, wow, Atlanta's got an enormous market momentum and latent assets that really haven't been deployed or leveraged. I mean, that's clear when you come here. And that was clear 5 years ago. It's even more clear today. But from your perspective, what did you take away from the tour that potentially will change how you think about this tax incentive or the business more generally?
Yeah, I think we've had the benefit because of our friends at Westside Future Fund. We've had the opportunity to go and see some of what we looked at yesterday, but it was interesting to see it from a different set of eyes with a different group of people on this bus tour and see some of the questions they were asking. And one of the things I think was really powerful and impactful to me was really what Ross was just sharing about. We stopped at a particular corner, and we've driven past this before, but we stopped there. We talked a little bit about what some of the possibilities might be for that particular area within one of the West Side neighborhoods. And I think that's really what I'm thinking a lot about, and that's that you can go kind of block to block, corner to corner. I think as a banker, we tend to look for scale very quickly. We don't like to do small projects that just doesn't feel very efficient. And yet, seeing some of the impacts and hearing, you've now shared about Louisville a couple times and kind of hearing some of the impacts there. I mean, I think that's powerful to us and helping us try to open our eyes to see how can we find efficient ways to bring what we do to a smaller scale. We all want scale. I think that's important. It's important for the program overall to be successful, to generate some scale in these communities. But that was helpful. And one of the things we talked about a lot yesterday is the real need for leadership. And if you don't marshal good leadership, this is not going to go anywhere. It is going to just end up being a tax incentive for folks, and the impacts that we could get may not be maximized by that. And I think here in Atlanta, we've got a real good advantage, again, in these communities because of the Westside Future Fund. You've got great leadership of John Amon, Cheryl Strickland. I saw Rachel here. There's several people probably from the fund here. We have been in conversations with the Grove Park Foundation, another neighborhood that I believe is located in an opportunity zone. Great leadership there. They're doing all that heavy lifting ahead of time so that we're not, worrying about the clock running out and going, hey, where are the shovel-ready projects? You've got good leadership here in Atlanta trying to create those types of opportunities. But I think it's going to take people like us continuing to go out and see those, understand what those opportunities are, be able to get our heads around the fact the scale might not be where we want it to be initially. But I think if we can continue to move things forward to shovel-ready status, that would help us. And that was one of the other observations just in driving around. There are a lot of things we can do. I'm not sure how ready some of those are relative to the capital that's on the sideline. I mean, in our case, going back to our fund, we only deployed about 65% of the dollars that we had to deploy because we couldn't. Now, we had a more narrow box than what many folks would have because of regulatory reasons, but we couldn't find enough projects to put those dollars out. And of course, maybe Ross, if we'd found you earlier, we could have done something with Village Capital. But But that was a challenge for us. So that's another observation. We've got to move some of these things along, get them ready, because you don't know when these gains will occur. And John and I were talking about this before we started today. Until we get more guidance on the rules about how flexible this capital really will be, there are some concerns about the timing and how flexible that money can be in these funds for investing in future projects that may not be ready to go yet. So we had to push our dollars out as quickly as we could because of the clock that was ticking. But maybe that will change as well. We'll get some guidance that will give us some more flexibility. But otherwise, we need more shovel-ready projects for the capital.
Any other thoughts before we go to Q&A from Ross or John? So let's open it up, and then I'll come back on this leadership question, because I think Atlanta has a moment here for different stakeholders to step up, and maybe we can get a little more concrete about that. But questions, comments, criticisms, suggestions? Oh, there's a whole bunch of people back there. Yeah. And just tell us your name and, whatever.
Hey, I'm John Ullman with the Westside Future Fund. And one of the questions I had, because one of the things we're concerned about is the opportunity zones unwittingly acting as a gentrification accelerator. And so the neighborhood right next to you toward English Avenue, 2/3 abandoned, and we're already aware of and opportunity zones investors, back to your point, buy up all the abandoned property, but then the residents that are there renting from other investors, guess what just happened to that property? And so their rents go up, they're out. And so other models you've seen, because it's a great tool, but that byproduct, especially like you take English Avenue, nearly all the residents are renting from private investors. And so how we mitigate kind of an unintended consequence of a great tool. So if you've seen models of how people are getting ahead of that, would be the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I can share. And John, I appreciate you asking the question. You've been name checked a couple times, so it's good to have you jump in. And thanks for you and the Westside Future Fund for your leadership on the West Side. I think that I think that capital is neutral. It is neither good nor bad. It depends on whose hands it's in. It is as we look at potential projects on the West Side specifically and run the numbers. The numbers of gentrifying a neighborhood, if you're just a cold-blooded investor, are more attractive than making allocations for affordable housing, et cetera. And I think that the values that we have and the values that people we work with have definitely want the latter. And I think that's why we're spending an incredible amount of time looking at this. And I think kind of base case, absent leadership from community development organizations like Westside Future Fund and absent leadership from the government to encourage mission-aligned investors, I think the former is much more likely to happen. It's not difficult if money is not a problem to acquire a bunch of properties and drive up rents. It is much more complicated to say, hey, we're going to build this and it's going to be 50% affordable and 50% market rate. But I have seen people across the country who very much want to do the latter. And if you run the pro formas, it takes slightly more complicated syndication of partnerships with people like Enterprise and people like you, the Westside Future Fund, and people like Invest Atlanta to work. But I would say absent leadership from the private sector and community development corporations, it won't happen. So I guess what I'd say, short answer is to prevent the doomsday scenario you're painting, which is one very possible outcome, it takes leadership from people in this room to say we need to get the right projects and we need to get the right syndicates and we need to do that quickly. And I would say investors are largely wanting to do the right thing, but don't have products that are what the right thing looks like right now. So my guess is that SunTrust, from a mission and community impact, would be much more interested in affordable housing on the West Side than flipping vacant properties on the West Side. It's just the latter product is much easier to put together because you don't have to collaborate with people. So I would that's my observation. It just comes down to leadership of who's building funds and who's syndicating these kinds of public-private philanthropic partnerships with funds.
I'll just add one other thing to that. Did I lose the mic? You're just louder than I am. which we already knew. One city, which I won't name because they're going to roll out their own publicly developed plan on this, has taken this issue head on. And I think it's first really important to understand where the dividing lines are across different types of communities. Actually, I want to do this because I always do this public experiment. What would people ballpark as a threshold for currently gentrified opportunity zone communities? Would most people put it at above 20% of the total national? Show of hands. Over 10%? Over 5%? How many opportunity zones today are gentrifying? I guess that's the question. We're trying to get a sense of public perception of how much, because that is something people are concerned about. People talk about it. The most pressing concern in most of the places. This is not to say it's not a concern in some places, because it absolutely is. But the much more common typology of opportunity zone is a place in decline, in significant decline over the last 10 years. And so you need two different playbooks, and this is what we're seeing cities emerge with. Within a city, you could have, as you do in Atlanta, roughly 30 opportunity zones. You could see in 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever the number is, there's the potential for either currently we're seeing gentrification or there's the potential for that new investment to come in and create that type of displacement pressure. And you need one very intentional strategy to deal with that. And so, for example, one city has said, we're doing our own analysis. We're going to find out which ones, based on both local qualitative analysis on the ground as well as the data, we're going to find out which ones are most susceptible to that displacement pressure. And we're going to put a plan in place that says, if you're building housing in those places, you have to build either a certain number of affordable units or you're paying into an affordability trust fund that allows us more broadly to create capacity that doesn't exist today. And they're getting everybody on the same side of the table so that for the investor side, the parameters are clear. And what we're seeing for the most part, investors, if you tell them, here's the marks you have to hit, they'll do that. But if you leave a blank open space, it's much harder for them to say, what's the right or wrong answer in any given individual transaction. So this to Ross's point where you need some leadership on the front end to say, from the city perspective, in partnership with local stakeholders, these are the places that we see as at risk. Here's the playbook that has to be in place to deal with those places. But you need a very different playbook for the other, what I would say probably the larger majority, places that are going to struggle to get the same type of incentive or investment interest that a smaller number of places are going to get. That's where you need even more of an intentional playbook to say, who are the partners philanthropically or in the CDFI community or in the lending institutions that will come alongside of us and make these deals pencil out in a way that on their own, even with this incentive as powerful as it is, may not move enough capital or move enough interest to actually make a difference. So breaking it down on not just a citywide basis, but place by place. What type of strategy is required in different types of places? Because if we paint all of these with a broad brush, either they're all in decline, which they're not, or they're all susceptible to gentrifying, which they're not, we end up with a very misaligned playbook. And that really has to start, in my view, with mayors. And this is why the work Bruce mentioned with Accelerator for America is so important. Mayors know their city, they can get people to the table, and they can set broad rules of the road. And this is the federal incentive. There's state and local tools that are very powerful to shape what type of development happens on the ground, but it doesn't happen without intentionality. So I think that's the key point there.
Yeah, so this may be one of the most important on the to-do list post this gathering. Ross and I are going to be in Kansas City on Thursday, Denver. I mean, when you think about the Vine City issue, this is a Denver issue. This is a Kansas City issue. This is a Seattle issue. Between those cities, which is a really small subset of these gentrifying zones, we got to figure out the playbook, and we got to figure out damn fast. So that may be the most important thing to come out of this gathering. Other questions? Right over here. Yep.
Just asking about the Shelby Park, this is Scott Schulten, asking about the Shelby Park deal that you did. Did you use opportunity zone financing? And if not, what do you see the impact of this new source of funding on that kind of project?
Yeah, so Shelby Park is an opportunity zone. 3 years ago, opportunity zone legislation hasn't passed, so we do have equity investors in the project who aren't getting opportunity zone credit. It would broadly increase their returns by, there are a bunch of ways you can cut it, but roughly 2 to 3%, depending on how you look at it, if they had. So I think it makes investments like Shelby Park more attractive. Taking a step back, I mean, if you are a wealth manager or a finance person, the opportunity zone incentive, I think, by itself, it's good. It's not enough to do something you wouldn't otherwise do. It's like, it's nice, but not really like we should completely redesign our whole investment strategy over it. The thing that is amazing to me is being in this room and being in 20 rooms like this over the last 6 months. Cities have not been having this kind of thoughtful conversation at this kind of scale, and this incentive, for whatever reason, all credit to John for this, has sparked broader conversation. So I think, to John Ammon's question, the right mixture is probably something that venture capitalists are somewhat uncomfortable with, probably something that looks slightly different from what the Westside Future Fund currently does, something that's slightly different than what real estate investors are comfortable with. Everyone's going to have to do something slightly out of their comfort zone, and this incentive is an excuse for people to think a little bit differently, and I think that's actually wonderful. So, Shelby Park happened before, but we didn't pitch this as like a real estate deal or a housing deal. We said we have this portfolio and here's what the community wants, and we're raising $5 million, and you can do equity or you can do philanthropy, and we got to $5 million, but we pitched it as a portfolio of things that created a desired change and had a theory of change behind it, rather than like, here, compare this to all the other real estate deals you're doing. It was just so different.
That's great. Back here. Yep.
Good morning. I have a pointed question.
Who are you?
I'm Adina Fisher with Deck 10 Opportunity Fund. I have a pointed question, if that's okay, and I have your permission to ask it, which is the coalescing of timing and readiness of, let's say, the government sector working with the entrepreneurial sector. Things in the government tend to go more slowly, and entrepreneurs are ready to work fast. And how does that work together if you're talking about a combination of philanthropists, government, lending institutions, and entrepreneurs?
I mean, one of the things I would say, just on the, I'm from Atlanta, grew up here, and it's kind of like prophet is never welcome in his own country kind of thing. But I would say that there is a lot of investment capital that reflects what Keitt was telling us. It's like, we realize these gains, and we don't care where they go. We just need to put them to work. And I would say Atlanta is probably middle of the pack in terms of speed of government, philanthropic, private sector working together. I mean, Bruce mentioned Colorado. I would say Colorado is at the head of the pack. There are a number of states and cities that are fast, and I guess just my kind of blunt outside-inside talk is the cities and states and communities that get that kind of collaboration working more quickly will massively disproportionately benefit in terms of where capital goes. And if it's the right kind of collaboration and the right kind of partnership, that's even better. So I would say, yes, you're right, and I think mayors and foundations need to work more quickly than they used to. I mean, I was saying to John, everyone is a little bit outside their comfort zone to work. Private investors are a little bit outside their comfort zone too. So that's just kind of where I see Atlanta around what I'm seeing across the country. And your pointed question is exactly the right thing to bring up, because it probably does need to go a bit faster.
Yeah, and I think what you're going to find are a bunch of first movers in the United States. They may be places that either Colorado, who has their act together on multiple fronts, or a place like Erie or South Bend, that this may be their last shot, right, in the next decade. I mean, no one's expecting the federal government to do anything intelligent anytime soon, right? So the question is whether, Atlanta could be a fast follower, right?
Right.
You might be a first mover with regard, let's say, to Vine City, which is a sort of a certain kind of subset of zones that you could hold a financing charrette next week, right? And begin to think through what John was saying about all the moves that could basically protect against excessive gentrification, at the same time bringing capital to a place that really does need capital. So I think that's a question for leadership here. But being a fast follower is not a bad thing. You can avoid all the brain damage of the first movers, and you can still get some stuff done. But do not go put your head in the sand and say, well, maybe it'll just go away, or let's think about 2020, or whatever people say to us as we go around the country. It is really important to engage on this stuff, and there's no excuse, public, philanthropic, corporate, university, hospital, to say, who knew? I mean, people need to engage. Question, there was another one over here, I think. Oh, right over here, yep. We'll come back.
Who's going?
Yep, right over here, and then we'll come back here. Yep. Go ahead.
Good morning, Natalie Kaiser with the Annie E. Casey Foundation. I am a little concerned that there might be an incentive to demolish rather than rehab real estate in the way the policy is structured. And I'm also wondering, since capital can flow anywhere nationally, if a municipality or state does decide to put some regulations of some kind in place, that might mean capital just goes elsewhere, and thus you have to incentivize policy-wise rather than regulate. So if you are interested in preserving property or preserving affordability or job creation or something like that, what kind of policy incentives are you seeing localities or states work with to help make that happen?
I'll take the first crack at that. On the affordability side, kind of to the answer earlier, you're seeing cities build in certain mandates with their opportunity zones that require certain thresholds to be met, but that's not really novel because that's already true in many places in a number of different ways in terms of having to hit certain types of affordability standards. It's just being more specifically applied when it comes to opportunity zones given the new interest. So I think that's even absent incentives, there's a lot of tools at their disposal in cities to start with that. Then when you add to that the fact that a lot of investors, as we've seen with SunTrust, want to use this in combination with a LIHTC or a new markets or historic preservation incentive. This is the equity part of a lot of those deals, and a lot of those deals require on the debt side, historic, and they all come with their own caveats and conditions, right? So it's not actually unconstrained equity capital, it's equity capital that can then be slotted into capital stacks that already come with a lot of preconditions and a lot of requirements. But none of that negates the fact that at a base level, if there's a concern about affordable stock, which there is in a lot of parts of the country, you have to start with a local plan that's going to channel that accordingly. And I don't think there's a risk, for example, in a city like Atlanta, if certain mandates are laid out, that's going to mean no real estate investment goes into Atlanta. I don't think it's that kind of marketplace nationwide. But I think clarity really helps to allow the market to respond accordingly. And without that clarity, you have a lot of false starts, I think, around the country. Your other question was about demolition. I don't know. I think it's kind of hard to speculate at this stage how much that's actually going to play out. There are a lot of places where, at least it's all anecdotal at this stage, but what we see are, again, led by cities, they're quantifying where they have usable assets that have just fallen into disrepair or are on some government ledger that wasn't even realized. I had a governor of a state tell me her biggest legacy to her successor is they actually went through a statewide exercise to quantify in opportunity zones all of the government-held property, much of which was a true surprise to her administration. I mean, think about that. And now they're thinking about a strategy to put it into productive use and put out RFPs with investors, and that's, again, another huge opportunity to shape. If you have a concern about what type of deals are coming in, you have control if it's on the taxpayers, if it's a taxpayer-owned asset. So there's all kinds of positive things that can be done that help to mitigate a lot of these hypothetical downside scenarios, but it takes quantification, it takes intentionality on the front end, but that should have been happening on some level anyway, right? I mean, this is Bruce's big takeaway as well, is that it's shocking that it took this to drive that kind of awareness, because what are we doing here? These are assets that could be put to use, and it shouldn't have taken a federal incentive to drive that kind of thinking, but now that it's here, let's take advantage of that opportunity.
I've got a question over here, and then one right over there, and then we'll come back. I think we're good on time, right? Yep. Good. Yep.
Hey, Rachel Carey, Westside Future Fund. So, as you're going around talking
to different potential investors and, and participants in designated census tracts all over the country. What are you thinking at this point in time about how you select your investors to ensure that their ownership of these projects promotes sort of a permanent transfer of equity into these communities?
Yeah, I think that's a really important conversation to be having with investors. So for example, if you're doing an investment in the west side of Atlanta, to do it well, and I would say actually to do financially well, if you go in and you buy a bunch of stuff and you build kind of market rate stuff, then the community is not going to like that, and that is going to dramatically change the value of the project. So I think to financially do well, as well as to make a better community, it's just a very different process than a typical real estate transaction. And I think being, in conversations I've had, what I have said, the comparable for this, what we're trying to do is not Blackstone's Opportunity Zone real estate fund, $1 billion fund, which is buy as many properties. I don't know if Blackstone is doing it. I would bet they will. But like that's not what you should think of when you think of what is this like. This is actually, this is just so different. There's not really a product that your wealth advisor currently knows of that is like this, because we haven't before had an incentive to create this product. And if you're okay with it being different, and if you're okay with, meeting with community entrepreneurs as a necessary part of the process and not like an annoying box that you have to check in order to get the money out the door, you're probably a very values-aligned investor. If you're like, come on, just get over with all this community stuff so we can get the money out there, it's probably not the right fit. And so I think, at least in our conversations, we've been very transparent about how we're doing it, and people's immediate reaction of like, oh, that sounds really complicated, or that's very cool, is a pretty good signal of whether it's going to be a good fit. One of the things I have found and observed is a real desire for that kind of intentional engagement from people in their own community. So, for example, there was an investor in Austin, Texas, who said, it's telling me what we're trying to think about, and he's like, well, that sounds very cool, and he had just realized a lot of capital gains, and he's like, I do $500,000 to $1 million in your fund, but if you do it in Austin, I'd do $5 to $10 million, because like I really want to be there, and I really want to go to the coffee shop where that we're invested in all that. So I do think that thinking about Atlanta. I was talking with AJ about this yesterday. Investing in downtown Atlanta, AJ found much more interest outside of Atlanta than in Atlanta investing in downtown. I do think there is a psychological barrier of people in Atlanta investing in their own town, even especially parts of town where they don't live. I think getting over that barrier and having the right conversations with the right people is worth investing in, because I do think the most values-aligned investors can well be people who live 10 miles north and have never even thought of this, but start to change their perspective when they get involved.
This is a really important point, because when you think about high net worth individuals in the United States, they all have their money in institutional investors who invested somewhere away from where these people made their wealth. The biggest effect of this may be to have conduits for local capital to reinvest in their own place. I mean, the Atlanta example of coming here and, go to downtown Atlanta and everyone talks about, here's the capital from outside that's looking here. That's repeated again and again across this country. So there's so much wealth here and all over the country that has to reinvest. This may be the way to do it. Question over here.
Michael German, I'm the director of HUD for Georgia. And I have had the experience of being in Denver 2 years ago working with them on their plan. And we just got back from a leadership meeting in Kansas City last week with the secretary. So Opportunity Zone is one of our secretarial priorities. But the question with me is, what do you think we should be doing to make this work?
Well, I was chief of staff of HUD under Clinton. So I think building from my relationship with Henry Cisneros and then Sean Donovan, who was the HUD secretary under Obama, I think what the country needs is communication about A, what is this new tax incentive, and B, as we look across the country, what are the new prototypes that are getting created around workforce housing or around the role of public housing using their assets, because a lot of public housing authorities own enormous amount of land and buildings, or around commercial corridor restoration. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's under the remit of HUD. And this is not about you using your tools, but it's you playing that sort of amplification role. So as a new innovative practice emerges in Atlanta or somewhere else, capture it, codify it, spread it. You've got a huge bully pulpit. And right now what's happening is a bunch of intermediaries, mostly whom are startups, are basically filling a role that in the past was played by the national government. So I think that's a critical piece for the department. It's not the usual, let's bring new incentives to the table. The incentive is already on the table. It's this communication role that is absolutely critical because, this is a pretty big country and we have 8,700 census tracts. And everyone's, to some extent, wandering around the wilderness going, what the hell's going on? We'll figure it out. We're good at this, but this would shorten the product cycle, so to speak. There was a question right over here.
This is the last question.
Dexter Warrior. So my question is to John. You mentioned part of the legislation envision actually getting not only to real estate and hard assets, but actually getting to businesses, entrepreneurs. Can you speak more to that in terms of how you envision that actually getting done? I mean, I think at the higher level in terms of real estate, we can kind of figure it out most likely. But how do you really get to the entrepreneurs in our communities to make them aware of this opportunity and how they can really benefit from it?
Thank you so much for that question. Two of the three things an opportunity fund can invest in are equity in businesses, right? So it's clearly, and if you hear the way that policymakers talked about this, I can tell you what they never talked about was this will be a grand national niche real estate incentive. It was always, this is a way to focus on entrepreneurs and people building businesses first and foremost at the heart of it. So, so this is the most important question to answer. There's two layers to it. One is, as I mentioned earlier, Treasury is the slowest in terms of their rule writing on this particular question. And my concern has been from the beginning that because we've gotten this issue wrong in every other attempt at place-based incentives, you don't accidentally get there with opportunity zones rulemaking. You have to start with, this is a fundamental cardinal priority. We're going to build the whole framework around equity into businesses as your starting point. And my gentle critique is I don't think that's what's happening so far. So it's not too late to get there, but the intentionality that we hope to see around this is not quite where it should be. And it's just slow. And so if you're making an equity, a real estate transaction, that's relatively straightforward. It's either in the zone or it's not. You know how to do real estate finance. You know where the equity piece fits in. People can figure that out for the most part, although clarity is good. But for a business, there's just far more variables to have to account for, which makes the rulemaking framework all the more essential. That's the federal side. That's eventually going to take care of itself. The next 3 to 6 months, I think we're going to have a lot more clarity. And so far, there's signs that they're really now trying to get some of these fundamental questions right. But to the point about education, how do you actually connect this tool with those who need it on the ground? Cities like Atlanta usually have incubators and accelerators. They usually have some kind of startup ecosystem leadership that is a top layer that can help organize events, sponsor the kind of products that are required for, if I'm a business in an opportunity zone, how do I know if I'm eligible for investment for an opportunity fund? That shouldn't be an individual problem to figure out. That should be a citywide problem to figure out, or it should at least be the problem of those in leadership in that entrepreneurial ecosystem to say, hey, great, we can collectivize this problem a little bit and figure out those resources. It also comes into play with tax lawyers and accountants and others. You want that expertise layer to be there to help you facilitate those transactions. And then the third piece is, how do you get to the funders? How do you actually create that interface between those who have the capital and those who are the eligible businesses? So that's a whole chain of events that has to happen, and I don't have any kind of magic bullet answer for it, but it starts with things like this. You get the people who care about that to the table, and just in this room, I am sure that there's enough expertise and capital and resourcing to start that process in the right direction. But my concern nationwide is that we'll be 2 years down the road on real estate, and then folks will go, oh yeah, there's another part of this that we should be thinking about. So really that conversation needs to start now, before there's rulemaking clarity, before you have all the answers, just to get people acclimated, because it's a process that takes time to play out. But I'm so glad you asked about it.
We are getting the proverbial yank.
Yank, you get the hook.
So thanks to the panel.
Yeah, let's give them a big round of applause. So I'm A.J. Robinson. Before I dismiss you, these guys have really elevated our education level, really got us to a different level just in the last couple of days, and we really owe them a great deal of thanks for that. And particularly Bruce. Bruce has been in and out of our community for 20 plus years on different things, but he really is a bright light in the world of economic development and city development, and we're thrilled to have you back, Bruce. So let's give him one more round of applause. So also thanks to the Arthur M. Blank Foundation for this collaboration with us. I think we've had a great couple of days here, capped by this panel. We've got a lot of hard work ahead of us, as Bruce said, to really maximize the potential of this tool and do it in a way that's equitable and inclusive and all the things you've heard about. But it's just a great opportunity, no pun intended, to continue this as well. So two housekeeping things. If you parked next door in the deck, be sure to stop by the desk out there, and we'll give you a validation for parking. And then lastly, this is a big, we want to encourage you to stick around and have conversation, but we can't do it in this room. There's a function at 12 o'clock, but just please move quickly out to the lobby. You can spend your time in the lobby, but there's a luncheon meeting here. So thank you again for coming.